Okay, so you want to own a shipping company. Buy a few giant vessels, sign some contracts, and watch containers full of other people's products cross the ocean while you collect the check. Almost 90% of everything traded across borders in the world moves by sea. The phone in your pocket, the shirt on your back, the coffee in your cup, all of it probably spent weeks floating across an ocean before it ever reached you. So owning the ship that carry the entire global economy sounds like one of the safest, most obviously profitable businesses a person could get into. Here's the problem. Some of the biggest shipping companies on Earth have lost billions of dollars in years when world trade was booming. Not shrinking, booming. Factories running at full capacity, ports jammed with cargo, consumers buying more than ever, and still, shipping companies were bleeding cash and filing for bankruptcy protection. That's the puzzle we're solving today. How does a business that carries the entire planet's economy on its back manage to go broke while that economy is growing? Let's start with the basic question nobody asks. Why do we even use ships? Airplanes are faster, trucks are more flexible, trains run on a fixed schedule you can set your watch to. And yet the vast majority of the physical goods on Earth travel by boat at a speed slower than a bicycle on journeys that can take weeks. The answer is cost. Moving 1 ton of cargo 1 mile by air can cost somewhere between 50 cents and $1.50. Trucking that same ton the same distance costs maybe 15 to 35 cents. Rail brings it down to 4 to 8 cents. Ocean freight, though, costs as little as 2 to 5 cents. Air freight is roughly 12 to 15 times more expensive per unit of weight than a ship, under normal conditions. Now remember what I said about the 90% of trade moving by sea. Here's why. A single ultra-large container ship can carry roughly 24,000 standard shipping containers in one trip. That's around 240,000 metric tons of cargo. To move that same amount of cargo by air, you would need more than 2,000 fully loaded Boeing 747 cargo planes. By truck, you'd need about 10,000 semi-trailers. One ship replaces an entire fleet of trucks the length of a small city. The physics behind this is simple once you see it. An airplane has to fight gravity the entire flight, burning enormous amounts of fuel just to stay in the sky. A ship only has to push through water, and the bigger the ship, the more efficient that push becomes per ton of cargo carried. So if ships are this efficient, this cheap, and this essential to global trade, why isn't every company that owns them sitting on a mountain of cash? That's what we're about to find out. Let's talk about what it actually costs to buy one of these ships in the first place, because the price tag alone will surprise you. A modern giant container ship, the kind that can carry over 15,000 containers, costs somewhere between $194 million and $275 million, brand new from a shipyard. A crude oil tanker, the huge kind capable of carrying 2 million barrels of oil, runs about $128 to $130 million. A bulk carrier, the type that hauls iron ore and grain, is cheaper, around $75 million. And a liquefied natural gas carrier, one of the most technically complex ships on the water, can cost up to $260 million. You don't have to buy new, though. There's a second-hand market, too, where you can pick up a 5-year-old version of these same ships for anywhere from $66 million up to around $220 million, depending on the type. Sounds like a bargain compared to new. But here's the catch nobody explains up front. Almost all of the world's shipbuilding happens in just 3 countries. China builds roughly half of all new ships. South Korea builds close to a third, focusing on the more complex vessels like gas carriers. Japan builds most of the rest, and right now, shipyards in these countries are booked out 3 to 4 years in advance. That means if you decide today that you want a brand new ship, you won't actually receive it for 3 or 4 years. And building it isn't a single payment either. Shipyards typically require the money in 5 installments of 20% each, tied to milestones like the keel being laid, the hull being launched, and the ship completing its sea trials. So the moment you sign that order, you're locked into a multi-year bet on where the shipping market will be when your ship finally touches water. Order at the top of a boom, and you might take delivery right as the market crashes. And buying the ship, whether new or used, is genuinely just the beginning. The moment that ship is yours, it starts costing you money every single day, whether it's carrying cargo or sitting completely empty at anchor. This is the part most people never think about. A modern container ship burns through somewhere between $22,000 and $38,000 a day in fixed costs before it earns a single dollar of revenue. Let's break down where that daily bill actually goes. Around a third of it is crew. A ship needs somewhere between 18 and 26 trained officers and sailors on board at all times, and they need salaries, food, medical coverage, and flights home when their contracts end. Another chunk, roughly a fifth to a quarter of the daily cost, goes to technical maintenance. Engine parts, generator repairs, replacement valves, and piping. Insurance eats up around 12 to 15%. Lubricating oil for the engines, believe it or not, runs into thousands of dollars a day on its own because ships need specialized synthetic oils that neutralize the acidic residue from burning heavy fuel. And then there's the classification survey, a legal requirement that every commercial ship be pulled into a dry dock twice every 5 years for a full inspection, new paint on the hull, and shaft repairs. That single event alone can cost between $1.5 million and $5 million. Now here's the part that really catches new owners off guard. If demand drops and you decide to park your ship, what the industry calls a layup, you might assume your costs drop close to zero since it's not sailing anywhere. They don't. Your daily operating cost falls to maybe $3,000 to $5,000, but your loan payments on that ship keep coming due exactly the same as before. If you own a small fleet of 10 idle ships, you can be burning $200,000 to $350,000 a day in cash, with zero revenue coming in to offset it. A ship without cargo isn't a break from spending. It's a liability with a heartbeat. The single biggest expense that swings around the most, though, is fuel, what the industry calls bunker fuel. On a large vessel, fuel alone can account for 50 to 70% of the total cost of a voyage. And the relationship between a ship's speed and how much fuel it burns isn't straight-line math. It's closer to a cube. Push a ship's speed up by a third, and the fuel burn doesn't go up by a third. It can more than double. Here's a real example. A large container ship sailing at full speed, around 24 knots, burns roughly 180 metric tons of fuel a day. At $600 a ton, that's about $108,000 a day just on fuel. Now slow that same ship down by about a third to 16 knots, something the industry calls slow steaming, and fuel burn drops to around 60 tons a day, cutting the daily fuel bill to roughly $36,000. That's a massive saving. The trade-off is that the voyage now takes longer, so you need more ships in rotation to keep a weekly delivery schedule, which brings its own costs right back into the equation. If you're finding all this genuinely interesting so far, this is a good moment to hit subscribe and like the video. It really does help the channel keep making deep dives like this one. So we've covered what the ship costs, what it costs to keep it running every day, and what it costs to fuel it. Now let's get to the part that's supposed to make all of that worthwhile. How a ship actually earns money. The revenue mechanism in shipping is the freight rate, sometimes called the charter rate or the spot rate, depending on the contract. And this is where the entire business either becomes a gold mine or a grave. Because these rates are some of the most volatile prices in the entire global economy, take crude oil tankers as an example. The benchmark daily earnings on a typical Middle East to Asia route have swung from around $10,000 a day, a level that doesn't even cover basic operating costs, all the way up to over $200,000 a day during periods of geopolitical panic and rerouting. Container shipping tells a similar story. Before 2020, the cost to ship a large container from Asia to Northern Europe averaged somewhere between $800 and $1,200. During the pandemic-era supply chain crunch of 2021 and 2022, that same container cost between $15,000 and $20,000 to ship. That's not a small increase. That's the same service, the same ship, the same route, earning 15 to 20 times more money almost overnight. Now do the math with me on what that actually means for an owner. Say your ship earns $200,000 a day at the peak of a boom, and your fixed daily cost is $25,000. That leaves you with $175,000 in pure profit every single day. Over a 3-month voyage, that's over $15 million in net profit from one ship. Suddenly, that $150 million ship you bought doesn't look so expensive anymore. It could pay for a meaningful chunk of itself in a single good quarter. But here's where it gets interesting. And here's the trap that's destroyed more shipping fortunes than almost anything else in the industry. When rates are that high, every owner in the business sees the same opportunity you just saw. And they all do the same thing. They rush to shipyards and order new ships to cash in on the boom. The problem is timing. Remember, ordering a new ship today means you don't actually receive it for another 3 or 4 years. So during a boom, dozens of companies place orders at the same time, all expecting the good times to continue. Years later, all of those ships get delivered into the water at roughly the same time, often right as the original demand surge has cooled off or completely reversed. Suddenly, there are far more ships available than there is cargo to fill them. Owners start undercutting each other just to keep their ships moving instead of sitting idle. Freight rates crash, sometimes below the actual daily cost of running the ship. And now those same companies that were making record profits a few years earlier are burning cash on every single voyage. This exact pattern played out in devastating fashion after the 2008 financial crisis. In the boom years leading up to it, global shipping companies had ordered so many new vessels that the industry's total order book stood at more than 50% of the entire existing fleet. Then the crisis hit. Global trade collapsed at the same moment that all those new ships were arriving. Freight rates fell below the running cost of the vessels, and companies started bleeding cash just to keep operating. One of the most striking casualties of this cycle came years later. In August of 2016, South Korea's largest shipping line, then the 7th largest container carrier in the entire world, filed for bankruptcy carrying more than $5.4 billion in debt. Dozens of its ships, loaded with more than $14 billion worth of other companies' cargo, were turned away from ports around the world. Port operators and tugboat companies were afraid they wouldn't get paid for handling the ships, so they simply refused entry. Vessels sat stranded at sea for months, cargo owners had no idea when or if their goods would ever arrive, and one of the largest shipping companies on the planet, an operator that understood this business better than almost anyone, collapsed almost overnight. How does a company with decades of experience, deep industry knowledge, and a massive fleet end up in a situation like that? The answer isn't that they made a foolish decision. The answer is structural. The costs of running a fleet are fixed and unforgiving. The revenue is wildly unpredictable. And the supply of ships can't adjust quickly to match sudden shifts in demand because building a new ship takes years, not months. That mismatch between rigid costs and volatile income is the single most dangerous feature of this entire industry. Owning the ship and earning a strong freight rate still isn't the whole picture because a ship only makes money while it's actually moving cargo. And there's a whole set of costs and delays waiting at the ports themselves. A single port call can cost anywhere between $50,000 and $250,000, covering things like pilotage, tugboat assistance, harbor fees, and the cranes that load and unload containers. A modern port with several fast cranes running at once can load or unload a large container ship in as little as 36 to 48 hours. But if there's a labor strike, bad weather, or a bottleneck getting containers onto trucks and trains, that same process can slow down dramatically, doubling the ship's time in port to 4 days or more. Every extra day in port is a day the ship isn't earning freight revenue, while its fixed costs keep ticking regardless. And there are financial penalties layered on top of this too. If cargo sits in the port yard longer than the agreed free time, the shipper is charged what's called demurrage. If empty containers aren't returned to the port fast enough, there's a separate charge called detention. A delay at one port doesn't just cost money there. It ripples down the ship's entire schedule, forcing it to burn extra fuel sailing faster later just to catch back up. Then there are the shortcuts, the canals, which sound like they should save money, but come with their own steep price. Passing through the Suez Canal, the route connecting Europe and Asia without sailing all the way around Africa, costs a large container ship somewhere between $500,000 and $900,000 for a single transit that takes less than a day. Sounds expensive. Now compare it to the alternative, sailing all the way around the Cape of Good Hope instead. That route adds somewhere between 3,500 and 4,500 additional nautical miles and 10 to 14 extra days at sea. The extra fuel alone can cost around $720,000, plus another $360,000 or so in extra crew and capital costs for those additional days. All in, avoiding the canal can cost over $1 million more per voyage than simply paying the toll. The Panama Canal has its own twist. It relies on fresh water locks that depend on rainfall filling a lake behind the canal. During droughts, the number of ships allowed through each day gets rationed, and owners have to bid against each other in auctions for a transit slot, with winning bids sometimes running $2 to $4 million above the normal toll just to jump the queue. And these choke points matter more than most people realize. When security concerns in recent years forced many ships to avoid the Suez Canal entirely and reroute around Africa, it effectively removed somewhere between 8 and 12% of the world's active shipping capacity from normal circulation, since those ships were now spending far more days at sea, just getting from one place to another. That single rerouting decision tightened the entire global freight market and pushed rates higher across routes that had nothing to do with the original disruption. None of this, the giant ships, the cheap freight rates, the efficient global trade network, would even be possible without one surprisingly simple invention. Before the 1950s, cargo was loaded onto ships one crate, one barrel, one sack at a time, by hand, by teams of dockworkers who could spend 10 to 20 days just loading or unloading a single vessel. Loading cargo this way cost around $5.86 per ton, and theft and damage were rampant with losses running above 15% of cargo value on some routes. In 1956, an American trucking entrepreneur figured out a better way. He converted an old tanker ship to carry standardized metal boxes instead of loose cargo, and the idea of the shipping container was born. Once container sizes became standardized worldwide, a box could move directly from a factory, onto a truck, onto a ship, and onto another truck on the other side of the ocean without ever being opened. Loading costs dropped to about 16 cents per ton, a reduction of more than 97%. Port time for a full ship dropped from weeks down to a day or two, and theft dropped to almost nothing. This single change is arguably the most important reason globalization as we know it was even possible. Beyond the daily operating grind, there's a whole category of risk that most people never think about until it happens, the catastrophic kind. Ships carry hazardous cargo, sail through storms, navigate crowded shipping lanes, and occasionally run aground or collide with something. A serious accident, an oil spill, a major cargo fire, can trigger fines, cleanup costs, and lawsuits running into the tens of billions of dollars. To protect against this, ship owners carry two very different types of insurance. Hull and machinery insurance covers physical damage to the ship itself, the kind of policy any expensive piece of property would need. But the bigger risk is liability to other people. A spilled cargo of oil, a bridge struck by a wayward vessel, injury to crew, the cost of removing a sunken wreck from a shipping lane. Commercial insurers generally won't take on liabilities that large and unpredictable on their own. So shipowners join what are called protection and indemnity clubs, mutual insurance pools owned collectively by shipowners themselves, which combine their resources to be able to cover claims running into billions of dollars if disaster strikes. Sailing through active conflict zones requires yet another layer, war risk insurance, priced against the full value of the ship for every voyage through a danger zone. One serious accident, even for an owner who has done everything right for decades, can erase years of accumulated profit in a single incident. So who in this industry actually walks away with the money? It turns out ownership and operation are often two completely separate businesses, connected through different types of contracts. In a bareboat charter, the owner simply hands over the empty ship and collects a fixed daily fee, while the person renting it pays for the crew, the fuel, the maintenance, everything. It's the lowest risk, lowest reward option for an owner. In a time charter, the owner provides the ship along with the crew, and the charterer pays for fuel and port costs on top of a fixed daily hire rate, a more common middle ground. And in a voyage charter, the owner takes on everything, the fuel, the crew, the port fees, the market risk, in exchange for the charterer simply paying to move a certain amount of cargo from one point to another. This is the highest risk and potentially highest reward arrangement, since the owner is exposed to every swing in freight rates and fuel prices. Above these owners sit the liner operators, the giant global brands that manage container networks, sell cargo space directly to importers and exporters, and mix their own ships with vessels chartered in from smaller owners to fill out their networks. And connecting all of them are shipbrokers, who match owners with cargo and typically collect a commission of around 1.25% to 2.5% of the value of every contract they arrange. Bigger ships sound like the obvious winning strategy, since a larger vessel should mean a lower cost per container. And up to a point, that's true. But there's a ceiling. Ships carrying over 20,000 containers require water depths of over 16 meters when fully loaded, which only a small number of the world's deepest ports can accommodate. Cargo bound for smaller ports has to be unloaded at one of these mega hubs and transferred onto smaller feeder ships, adding an entire extra layer of handling costs that can eat into the savings the giant ship was supposed to provide in the first place. And a giant ship only saves money if it's sailing close to full. A massive vessel sailing at 2/3 capacity can actually cost more per container than a smaller ship sailing nearly full. Size without demand to match it isn't an advantage. It's dead weight. On top of all of this, regulation keeps raising the bar. Global rules cap the sulfur content allowed in ship fuel, forcing owners to either switch to a more expensive, cleaner fuel or install exhaust cleaning equipment, costing between $2.5 and $5 million per ship. New efficiency rules now grade every ship annually on its carbon emissions, and ships that score poorly can be forced into mandatory speed reductions or expensive retrofits. Ships sailing to or from European ports now have to buy carbon allowances for a share of their emissions, adding a direct and growing tax bill. And owners who want to future-proof their fleets with ships that can run on alternative fuels like methanol or ammonia are paying 15 to 30% more upfront to build them, an extra $15 to $35 million per ship. So knowing all of this, can you actually build real, lasting, wealth-owning ships? The owners who succeed over the long run generally aren't the ones betting on a single great year of freight rates. They're the ones who play the cycle itself. When the market crashes and weaker competitors are forced to sell, patient owners with cash reserves buy distressed, older ships for a fraction of their original cost. When the market recovers, they either sell those same ships for a large gain or lock them to long-term charters at strong rates. Many structure each individual ship as its own separate legal company so that if one vessel runs into serious trouble, it doesn't drag down the rest of the fleet. And the most sophisticated owners use financial contracts tied to freight rates and fuel prices to lock in guaranteed income years in advance, insulating themselves from the very volatility that destroys less careful competitors. In this industry, timing and financial discipline matter more than the size of the fleet. Let's put two realistic pictures side by side, because this is where the whole business finally comes into focus. Picture the optimistic case first. You've bought a mid-sized container ship for around $150 million. Freight rates are strong, averaging you around $80,000 a day in net revenue after fuel and port costs. Your fixed daily costs, crew, maintenance, insurance, and loan payments come to about $30,000 a day. That leaves you with roughly $50,000 a day in profit, or around $18 million over a full year. At that pace, it would take you a little over 8 years to earn back your original investment, assuming absolutely nothing goes wrong along the way. Now the realistic case. 2 years into owning that ship, a wave of newly built vessels floods the market, just like it always eventually does. Freight rates collapse from $80,000 a day in net revenue down to perhaps $20,000 a day, barely above your fixed costs. Suddenly, you're not making $50,000 a day. You're making, at best, a couple $1,000s a day, or in a genuinely bad stretch, actually losing money once you account for an unplanned repair or a slow port season. The difference between your best year and your worst year isn't small. It can easily swing by $15 to $20 million annually, on the exact same ship, doing the exact same job. That gap right there is the entire story of this industry in one sentence. The steel doesn't change, the crew doesn't change, the route doesn't change. What changes is the market underneath you, and whether you had the financial discipline to survive the years when it turns against you. Before we wrap up, if you want a deeper structured breakdown of how businesses like this are actually built and run, there's a detailed business guide linked in the description and pinned in the comments below, well worth checking out. Owning ships was never really about the ships. It's about surviving the years the market doesn't cooperate, long enough to be standing when it finally does. If you found this breakdown useful, do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share it with someone who'd find it interesting. Thanks so much for watching.